What was life like to live earlier in our community?
If you're talking all the way back in the colonial days, the people had to produce everything. So it was a rough life. I think the average age for an adult was in the mid-30s. There was a high mortality rate for children just because there wasn't the medical care that we have nowadays. But mostly life was work. I mean, you got up in the morning, you had to feed the animals, milk the cows. To prepare food, you had to hunt or catch the food. There were no grocery stores at the time. Light was provided by candles. So the children and the ladies made candles. That was one of their big jobs. Children from the age of 3 years and up had chores to do, even if it was just feeding the chickens. And the men would tend to the fields and the kids would tend to the gardens. That would be one of the things that was their responsibility. So it wasn't a rubber.
Well, was there any family members in the battle?
Well, the Tods, you have to remember back in the day, the farms were big, so they were 1,000 acres apiece, which could encompass the entire peninsula. So there were only a few families on the peninsula, and that included families across Back River, in the Back River Neck Peninsula, the Porters and others. And then on the other way across Bear Creek, you had the Solers family, which is now called Solers Point. So you had the Shaw family and the Stansbury family. I mean, there were just these families that had these historical farms. And because you didn't have the roads, remember, you didn't have the Beltway, you didn't have cars, you didn't have buses, so wherever you went, you had to ride your horse or take your buggy. So what happened was these families kind of intermarried, and their kids, started their own families and that kind of thing. So we know for sure that the Todds were in. We know that the Stansburys had some members in. I can almost guarantee you that every family on the peninsula had at least some family members who were involved with, if not with the Battle of North Point, with the War of 1812 and the Battle of Baltimore.
Can you tell us more about the Battle of North Point?
Well, the Battle of North Point, so our peninsula is where the British landed, approximately 3,500 troops, and they marched towards Baltimore. Well, the only road, a historical name of it, was Long Log Lane, and that's because we had such huge trees here that they would cut down and send to New England sometimes to make ships. The Todds made ships. They were shipbuilders. So the British, now it's North Point Road. It used to be called Old North Point Road a few years ago. Yeah. So the British marched up North Point Road towards Baltimore. And they met the American forces at Trap Road and North Point Road. And that's approximately where General Stricker Junior High School is now. And the battle ensued. There were several thousand Americans, several thousand British. The battle raged for hours. It was hand-to-hand combat, so it was something that I can't comprehend how they probably felt at that. One thing you have to remember, though, is the technology for warfare and for weaponry was nowhere near what it is now, so the soldiers had to get close together to fire or they would miss, and they missed more likely any time because the bullets that they used were around lead. They weren't really meant to go straight exactly, so they kind of aimed in the direction of where the enemy was. But when the smoke cleared, the British had advanced up to Bread and Cheese Creek. There was a hospital there, and it was only about 100 years ago that hospital was torn down. It was a Methodist meeting house, so it was a meeting house at a church. And you have to think, when so many men were wounded, they had to have a hospital. So they commandeered that building as the hospital. And if you see some of the historical recollections from my grandparents and your great-great-grandparents or great-great-great-grandparents, they remember us living in that area as children and the bullets still being in that building. So when you really look back at the Battle of North Point, it was a brutal brutal battle. It contributed to the British being unsuccessful of taking Fort McHenry and burning Baltimore. They didn't like Baltimore because we were a city that supported the schooners, and they were like mercenaries hired by the government to attack British ships, and that's a whole other story we could talk about. But the Battle of North Point was pivotal. If the British would have taken Baltimore and destroyed Fort McHenry, we can only surmise what direction the war would have taken. But with them leaving Baltimore, sailing out of North Point without accomplishing what they had set sail to do, you know, it gave the Americans more confidence. And that was actually the last battle before the war ended. There was one more big battle in the War of 1812, and that was the Battle of New Orleans. But in all reality, a treaty had already been signed in Europe, which ended the war. Just communication was so slow back in the day, the word hadn't gotten back to America yet that the war was over. So they had the Battle of New Orleans, and the British lost really badly in that battle. But that was the significance of the Battle of North Point, especially with the death of General Ross.
Researching about the battle.
The thing I like the most about researching the battle is you never know where it's going to take you. And it's just like any historical research or genealogy, family genealogy is real big right now. People looking back, trying to find who their ancestors are. The fun part is as you read documents, as you read personal letters, as you read historical recollections, you learn more. I mean, every time I go to a lecture or every time I see a presentation or talk to somebody who's familiar with the battle, you learn something different. Now, one thing you have to really be careful when you're doing historical research is over the years, the truth can be stretched a little bit. So you have to kind of interpret and make sure that if you're reporting something as factual, that it actually was a fact and came from a first party who was there. That's what you really need. So we have some artist renderings of the Battle of North Point. We have some historical documents from people who were at the Battle of North Point. So they're the ones you rely on the most. But that's my most favorite part about trying to do any research for history.
What did you like about the community that you researched?
Back in 1814, I think the thing that really stuck with me was how, even though there were only a few farms, even though there were not many people, I'm not sure what the count was, how they came together as Americans. You know, people back in that day, and even today, are very, very independent. They took care of themselves. They had the vision of moving forward as a family and as a farm and then as a community. But when they had a threat by this outside force, which the British were the strongest military in the world at the time. They had just fought a major battle against Napoleon. That seems so long ago. And they had defeated Napoleon. And then they were coming to us. And these were farmers. The Americans were just people who had a stake. You know, we had something to lose. You know, they had worked so hard to clear their land, to create their communities, to raise their families. And that's what brought them together, to preserve what their vision for this country was. And that's the message that we should have forever moving forward. You know, we all are different. We all have our opinions. But when the time comes and we have to step up, we're all Americans. We all have one goal. That's the safety of our family, the benefit of our community, and moving forward. And I think that is just one of the strong points of all Americans. And as long as we have that, our country will remain strong. And that's the thing I've gotten the most out of doing all the research on the War of 1812 and the community.